Recently, Pope Francis was visiting Singapore, where he went to an interfaith gathering. At the gathering, he said, quote, "All religions are paths to God. I will use an analogy. They are like different languages that express the divine," end quote. Now, I'm a theological conservative, and my Catholic social media feeds reflect that. So after the Pope said this, my social media world lost its collective mind. Some said that the Pope should apologize and issue a clarification. Others said he should resign. Others said he should be deposed. Some accused him of heresy. Oof. I admit, even I find myself scratching my head at the things Pope Francis says from time to time. So what should we make of him? Hi, this is Justin Hibbard, and you're listening to Why Catholic, my podcast about the what and why of Catholicism. Since episode 108, we've been focusing on the papacy. We've talked about the Jewish roots of the papacy, St. Peter as the first pope, the primacy of the pope, papal infallibility. We did a brief survey of some really bad popes throughout history, and then we talked about a few great popes. Last time, we took a look at the history of papal elections, and today, I'd like to talk about our current pope, Pope Francis. Let me begin by saying this. I think Pope Francis is one of the reasons I am Catholic today. Let me explain why. I was born in the early 1980s, so most of my life was during the time of Pope John Paul II. Even though St. Pope John Paul II will go down as one of the greatest popes in history, which I highlighted in episode 113, in my Baptist and anti-Catholic upbringing, we didn't appreciate the Pope. In many ways, we saw the Catholic Church as this distorted practice of Christianity, and so the Pope was merely a leader who was leading people away from true Christianity. We, or at least I, didn't appreciate the type of leader Pope John Paul II was because I was too busy being critical of the Catholic faith. And coming from a Baptist perspective, the papacy was just too much power for one person. True story. I grew up in a church where there was this unwritten rule that the pastor was expected not to park closest to the church. Now, mind you, we had a tiny church, maybe 10, 12 cars in the parking lot, so it's not like people were fighting for a parking space. Our church once hired a pastor who had a severe limp due to polio in his youth. He had a handicap placard on his car, and one of the elders was really hung up on the fact that he parked in the handicap spot, which was close to the church. And considering he was the only disabled person at the church, he wasn't taking someone else's parking spot. Another unwritten rule was that the pastor was to be the last in line during our monthly after-church fellowship lunches. So I point this out because the opulence of the papacy, the fancy clothes, the spotlights, the adoring crowds, the Pope-mobile, it was completely lost on me and those in my circles. I was working at a Catholic school when Pope Francis was elected. What immediately stood out to me about Pope Francis was his rejection of the opulent life. He didn't want to live in a luxurious papal apartment. He wanted to live modestly. He wanted to go to the prisons and wash the feet of the prisoners. He rejected everything that turned me off about the papacy. And in reality, had I actually been paying attention to his predecessors instead of judging them from a place of ignorance, I would have seen their obvious humility. I also would have recognized the marvelous work of Pope John Paul II, as well as the geniusness of Pope Benedict XVI, things that I certainly appreciate now. But I was working at a Catholic school when Pope Francis became Pope, so I was immersed in a place where people were carefully watching and listening to the Pope. And what immediately caught my attention, what caught my intrigue, what appealed to me the most as a non-Catholic was Pope Francis's humility. I want to say that up front because I know there are many theological conservatives who are outspoken critics of Pope Francis. So if you're one of them and you think that I'm being too generous to the Pope, I want to be completely transparent and give you a little background as to why I have a soft spot for him. He made a really good first impression, and not just on me, but many Protestants. In explaining Pope Francis from my perspective, for what it's worth, I would like to use an analogy that I hope will be helpful. In my career in sales, we learned a variety of sales methodologies. A sales methodology is a philosophy, a shared language, and approach to selling. Each company adopts a sales methodology and says, this is our approach to sales. In one of these methodologies, we were introduced to the terms toward and away language. An example of toward language is, you can save 15% with a 15-minute phone call. Juxtapose that with a call to action like, stop wasting 15%. That's an example of away language. According to this particular sales methodology, away language is much more effective in selling because it creates a sense of urgency. It's meant to prod and shock someone into quick action. Instead of saying, our solution will save you time and money, we were trained to say something like, stop wasting money and valuable time. I've been thinking about this with respect to how we talk about Christianity. In the past, I did extensive writing on blogs and social media, and it often came primarily from a place of criticism. I would often write about what was wrong with the world, and particularly of modern Christianity. It was highly effective at getting the likes and the shares because it was primarily an away language approach. One day, I got the sense that God was saying to me, "You're really good at telling the world what's wrong with the world. What if instead you highlighted what is good, truthful, and beautiful about the Catholic Christian faith?" I often think about Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, where Fred Rogers invited us into his world, where he showed us what goodness looks like. For example, he didn't preach a sermon about the evils of racism. Instead, he invited Officer Clemens, a black police character on his show, to soak his feet in a baby pool with him on a hot day. It wasn't a show about what not to do in life. It was a show about how to live and create a better world. I follow this Instagram account called The Holy Nope. The whole shtick is that this Protestant pastor pretends like he's attending various church services that have gone off the rails. He shows these clips of a pastor giving a heretical sermon or a bizarre Pentecostal service where people are running up and down the aisles and convulsing uncontrollably. Then he pretends to go back home, shut the door, and says, "Nope." It's all meant to show, in his opinion, the distorted practices of Christianity. It's entertaining, if not eye-opening, to watch. I usually agree with him, but I find myself asking the question that was asked of me. You're really good at showing what's wrong with Christianity. Are you capable of showing what right looks like? I sometimes tune into another young Catholic social media influencer named Isabel Brown. Most of the time she talks about some facet of what's wrong with society. She's full of energy, she's built a very popular and successful platform, and I usually agree with her perspective. But I often wonder how many people that disagree with her actually tune in. How many people does she get to change their minds? We tend to tune into the people that share our perspective, and it creates this echo chamber of sorts. And so to that respect, away language is really effective at preaching to the choir. We nod our heads in agreement, we like it, and we share it. But is away language effective at reaching and resonating with people that think differently? When I was once traveling, I attended a mass with a friend who is on a very different theological page than me. The pastor had a homily that just took aim at the whole woke culture. I shifted uncomfortably in the pew because while I agreed with him, I knew my friend sitting next to me did not, and I imagined that each sentence offended my friend more and more. Sure enough, within a couple of minutes, my friend got up and walked out. There are some that would argue that that priest was doing his job. I bet afterwards someone came up to him and told him, "Hey, don't worry about that person that walked out. It's because you said all the right things. Sometimes you got to be willing to offend people. You got to tell them how it is." But how effective is that? It certainly didn't endear my friend to the message. His away language approach preached to the choir, but it didn't do anything to reach people outside the church. And the attendance that Sunday reflected it. I mention this because this philosophy has really helped me understand Pope Francis. I watched a documentary on Hulu called The Pope Answers. The producers invited a group of Spanish-speaking young adults from various Spanish-speaking countries to come and ask questions and dialogue with Pope Francis. These young adults came from a variety of backgrounds and lifestyles. For example, there was one gentleman who had been abused by a Catholic priest. There was one woman who had been a nun and left her order and became a lesbian. There was an individual that identified as transgender. There was another one who had an abortion. And then there was one lone young lady who was a faithful and devout Catholic. Each person had a chance to ask the Pope a question, and it pertained to some aspect of their life and lifestyle. It was sort of like, what does the church say to a person like me? I was rather amazed at how much the Pope just listened to the conversation and how little he preached. I'll be transparent in saying that a part of me was rather frustrated with him. I wanted the Pope to say, look, you can either follow Jesus or you can follow your own desires. But he didn't. I just got the distinct impression that with every word, he wanted to draw that person into the church. He didn't want to shut the door on them, but rather leave open the possibility that one day they might reflect upon the Pope's kindness, walk into the church, find Jesus, and find the hope of true love. I think it's also important to remember that the Pope is a Jesuit, and Jesuits think and talk about theology with a lot of nuance. Many of them focus on the social teaching of the Catholic Church. I was recently looking into Masters of Theology programs from Catholic universities, and I quickly ruled out all of the Jesuit schools, even though Jesuit universities are the most common schools in the U.S. They just seem to focus on a different perspective than what I was looking for. I much prefer a rigorous, orthodox approach to theology, and for the most part, that's not generally the way Jesuits approach it, or at least not these days. And I think this is what theologically conservative Catholics find the most frustrating when they listen to an interview with Pope Francis. The interviewer is trying to get the Pope to say something shocking. Maybe it's to say that he's in favor of same-sex marriage, or maybe to say something definitive against it. But it seems like Pope Francis is uncomfortable with that, both from the Jesuit perspective, as well as being the pastor of the Catholic Church. For those of us that want him to lay it down and diffuse any ambiguity, it's incredibly frustrating. But I think it's important to remember that Pope Francis, in my opinion, is always thinking about that person who wonders, is there a place for me in the Catholic Church, even when he's being interviewed on a broadcast that will reach a large audience? The other thing that is frustrating is that Pope Francis speaks with a lot of theological nuance, but the liberal media, who are neither theologians or are able to appreciate theological nuance, take something the Pope says and run with it. It is like they are eager for the Catholic Church to be progressive and liberal and throw off these staunch theological conservative ideas like marriage is between one man and one woman, or ordination is only for males. And so anytime Pope Francis says something that's loaded with theological nuance, they interpret it in its most liberal light. Now, I would argue that Pope Francis doesn't help the situation with some of the things he says. We saw this with Fiducia Supplicans, which was on the topic of blessing people in same-sex relationships. I think the document was confusing at best, and we saw how the media interpreted it in its most liberal light. I was sitting down working on an episode of this podcast when I got a notification from the Associated Press reporting that Pope Francis is now allowing priests to bless same-sex couples. I was like, what? And then you have opportunists like Father James Martin, who has made it no secret that he hopes the church moves in this direction. He seems to have secured his role as the spokesperson for the liberal wing of the Catholic Church and is probably on speed dial at every liberal news outlet. Sure enough, he made an appearance on the front page of the New York Times blessing a gay couple. It's rather embarrassing. It's embarrassing to get questions from my Protestant friends that ask, what's going on with your church? Or what's going on with your Pope? Or is it true that now the Catholic Church has changed its stance on gay marriage? A little aside, in the last episode, I mentioned how on the day Pope Benedict XVI resigned, lightning struck St. Peter's Basilica. On Pope Francis's birthday, December 17, 2023, the day before he published the highly controversial document Fiducia Supplicans, a lightning bolt struck a statue of St. Peter at the sanctuary of Our Lady of the Rosary of San Nicolas, north of Buenos Aires, Argentina. Buenos Aires was Pope Francis's archdiocese while he was an archbishop. The lightning bolt pulverized the key and halo of the statue. Maybe that's just coincidence. Maybe it's an omen. But going back to documents and statements like Fiducia Supplicans, we feel like we have to do Popesplaining. No, that's not what he said. This is what the document actually says. No, faithful Catholics, at least in my experience, do not take Father James Martin seriously. It's exhausting. I have to step back and take a deep breath and remember that there's a lot of things at play. There's the liberal world that thinks that Pope Francis is this liberal progressive who is going to take the church in this whole different direction, and he's not. And I have to remember that Pope Francis's charism is not theological, it's pastoral. I have to keep in mind that I think he's always wanting to draw the outsider into the church. In a world obsessed with away language, he's a toward language guy. Now, with that said, I don't feel the need to defend all of Pope Francis's decisions. And while I think that maybe some of his more controversial decisions have come from some of his advisors, ultimately he's the one who signs off on them. As I was exploring Catholicism back in 2021, I learned about Pope Francis's restrictions on the traditional Latin Mass. As someone who occasionally attended Latin Mass, this confused me. I called my longtime Catholic friend Martin to help me understand what was going on. After a lengthy explanation of liturgy wars that included the ultra-traditionalists, sometimes referred to as rad-trads, and those that preferred the Novus Ordo, the new way we do Mass, he welcomed me to the Catholic Church like one who welcomes their significant other to their family after an awkward fight at Thanksgiving dinner. Growing up in a traditional Baptist church, I was no stranger to liturgy wars, so I understood. However, to many of my new Catholic friends who had embraced the beauty of the Latin Mass without creating dissension, it was hurtful. This was the first time I can think of where I really had to wrestle with this tension between wanting to be Catholic, yet disagreeing with the Pope. What do I do with that? What do I do when Pope Francis makes these statements that seem to water down the gospel or create ambiguity on issues related to Catholic morality? Here's what I've come to realize about Pope Francis, and I find this helpful for my own peace of mind, and I hope it's helpful for you as well. While Pope Benedict XVI's charism was clearly theological, Pope Francis's is pastoral. I tend to believe that the College of Cardinals, to some extent, elect a pope whose strengths counterbalance the weaknesses of the previous pope. While I think the Netflix movie The Two Popes gets a lot wrong about Pope Benedict XVI, I think it speaks at least to the world's perception of him and how they think of Pope Francis as the pastoral opposite. And I get it because as an outsider who paid little attention to the Catholic Church or the papacy, that was my perception of Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis. I don't know Pope Francis personally, but I imagine he'd much rather have a conversation about what God is doing in your life than, say, a conversation on some hefty theological topic like the Trinity or the hypostatic union. I don't think he's interested in debate as much as he's interested in finding common ground. He seems to be uninterested in calling out what the world gets wrong and trying to find common ground with what it gets right. As someone who has historically been in a way language kind of person when it comes to matters of faith and morals, and who is learning to be more of a toward language person, I find this rather admirable. Am I giving Pope Francis the benefit of the doubt? Absolutely. Some might accuse me of being overly generous. So let me say this. I think that is what it means to honor someone, in this case, our Holy Father. I think it means to give him the benefit of the doubt and try to see the world from their perspective. For the person that blasts Pope Francis on social media or badmouths him every chance they get, here's a strong word of caution. Stop. First, you are creating scandal. You are airing dirty laundry out in the open in a neighborhood full of Protestants and Eastern Orthodox Christians. What do you think seeing such division causes them to think? They already think the papacy and everything the church has done to strengthen it is ill-advised at best, if not downright heretical. You just pour fuel on their fire. Secondly, you're neither being Christ-like nor helpful when you do that. Jesus tells us that when our brother offends us, we need to go to him privately. If he resists correction, then we take that to the next level. Why? Our goal is to help correct our brother, and embarrassing him and publicly humiliating him will not provide the necessary correction. If you were to lambaste me publicly for my podcast, do you think I'm going to take a second to listen to you when you try and offer me advice? No, of course not. As far as I'm concerned, you're not trustworthy. You're out to humiliate and embarrass me. Now, if you come to me privately and say, hey, I think you got this wrong on your episode, would you be willing to have a conversation about it? Even in the end, if we disagreed, I'd be foolish not to honor you simply because you took the time to honor me. So how do you offer correction to Pope Francis? I actually talked about this in episode 112 when I said that the Code of Canon Law calls it our obligation at necessary times to correct our pastors. However, we also need to follow the example of St. Catherine of Siena, who privately corresponded with Pope Gregory XI. You may be thinking, yeah, but he won't read my letters or emails. Well, I guarantee you that you have 500 trillion times better odds that he'll read a letter you wrote to him personally over something you posted on social media. And my last piece of advice for the loud critic of Pope Francis is really take some time to be introspective and examine if you have fallen into negative sentiment overload. When we begin with something like, I can't stand this person, so I'm going to discount, disregard, and disdain anything they've said because it came from them. That's a clear example of negative sentiment overload. We see this in politics all the time. Candidate so-and-so said this, therefore it's the opposite of my position. That is neither healthy nor Christ-like. Instead, try and see it from their perspective. If nothing else, recognize the impossibility of his situation, like talking to the liberal media who wants him to be radically liberal, while at the same time discussing theological topics while being the pastor of over 1 billion people. He's in an impossible situation, to say the least. It's why he admitted after his election that he never wanted to be pope. It's why many cardinals throughout history told their brothers that if they were elected, they would turn down the papacy. A good way to overcome negative sentiment overload is gratitude. As someone who thought of the papacy as a monolith, grouping unsavory popes like Leo X with great popes like John Paul II, I would suggest that we should be thankful that we seem to be living in a golden era of the papacy. Pope Francis is certainly not perfect, but no pope was. We could have a pope like some of the ones I talked about in episode 112. And while they set a low bar for the papacy, we should be thankful that Pope Francis is absolutely nothing like those popes. We should appreciate the humility he has brought to the papacy. And really, the best thing we can do is pray for Pope Francis. As Catholics, we think of prayer not merely as a petition, but our greatest weapon against evil. Our prayers are fiery darts against the evil one, and the evil one has all of his demons and weapons aimed at Pope Francis. Nothing gives Satan more joy than watching the leader of the Christian church fail to live up to his calling and watching Christians fall into disunity. Pope Francis needs our prayers, not just during the prayer intentions at Mass, but every single day. So let me end by offering this prayer taken from the Knights of the Holy Eucharist for Pope Francis. Please pray with me. Lord, source of eternal life and truth, give to your shepherd, Pope Francis, a spirit of courage and right judgment, a spirit of knowledge and love. By governing with fidelity those entrusted to his care, may he, as successor to the Apostle Peter and Vicar of Christ, build your church into a sacrament of unity, love, and peace for all the world. We ask this through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever.
Thank you for joining me for Why Catholic. Be sure to subscribe to Why Catholic wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to my Substack site and get the next episode in your email inbox. As a subscriber, you get a special discount code to the Why Catholic Etsy store. If you've been blessed by this podcast and you're feeling generous, there's also a way to financially support it, and patrons get some extra perks. To become a free subscriber or a patron, just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Also join me on Instagram at whycatholicpodcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening. My name is Justin Hibbard, and this is Why Catholic. God bless you.